welcome to the first event in our series on power and accountability in tech, brought to you by the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, a new interdisciplinary research center whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. My name is Michael Karanevas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I'll start by acknowledging UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As I was planning for this panel, I was originally going to open by noting how timely the conversation is following on the heels of last week's coverage of the Facebook papers. But as I thought about it, I realized it really could have been any week. In recent years, the news cycle has been dominated by these kinds of stories. And while they touch on different issues, a genocide here, racially discriminatory algorithm there, abuses of personal data, firing whistleblowers, the common thread to all of it is the incredible rise in power of a handful of massive tech companies who now exercise unprecedented influence over our lives and our democracy, and the growing accountability gap that we face as a result of the interplay between these closed, insular corporate structures and the very public role that the companies now play. And I see that as one of the most important, if not the most important, legal and policy questions of our time, which is why we wanted to host this conversation series. The series begins with panels at this time from today through Thursday that scope the issue from different perspectives. So for example, tomorrow we have representatives from different tech companies. Wednesday, we have 3 former regulators. And all of that leads into Friday's sort of full day discussion series of events, panels, looking at understanding how we build accountability structures in this space, the role of regulation, the limits of regulation, et cetera. But today's panel is aimed at introducing and scoping the problem. We have an incredible roster for this discussion. Sarah Roberts is an associate professor of gender studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, a co-founder of both the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry and the Mindru Initiative on Technology and Power, and also quite well known for her groundbreaking research on content moderation, particularly behind the screen, content moderation in the shadows of social media, which is required reading for anyone active in this space. Wafa Ben Hassin is a principal on the responsible technology team at Omidyar Network, who was previously the Middle East and North Africa policy manager for Access Now, and has consulted for the International Finance Corporation in Tunisia, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Nathaniel Raymond is a lecturer at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale, previously the founding director of the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology at the Harvard Humanitarian Institute Initiative, who has extensive experience on the interplay between technology and human rights abuses. And Andre L. Brock is an associate professor of Black digital media at Georgia Tech, whose scholarship examines racial representations in social media, video games, Black women and weblogs, whiteness, and technoculture, including innovative and groundbreaking research on Black Twitter. His NYU press book titled Distributed Blackness, African-American Cybercultures was published in February 2020 and has won several awards for, including for best work in internet studies given by the Association of Internet Researchers and for outstanding work in an African-American popular culture series given by the Popular Culture Association. So we're going to start with a discussion among the panelists, and then move to Q&A with the audience for about the last 30 minutes or so. I would invite audience members to either put their questions or comments directly into the chat, or if you're interested in any point, raise your hand to start to form a queue, and we'll be happy to call on you directly. So just to kick things off, and I think is a good starting point for this discussion, I think a good opening is to try and figure out how we got here. And I'd like to pass it over first to Sarah Roberts, who can introduce the rise of content moderation as a core element of the public discourse.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all the panelists and all the participants here today. I think telling the story of content moderation of social media is, in fact, a great way to kind of trace the contours of the power and the expanse of this industry as it has grown over the past decade and a half. It started out in terms of content moderation. The practice itself started out really as an afterthought. It was never considered a central practice that any of the social media firms were really interested in being involved in, for a number of reasons. Certainly because there's really traditionally not, from a pragmatic standpoint, it has not been seen as having a great financial upside for the firms. It's a cost center. It's a place where spending happens and there's not revenue generated from their perspective. I think it's arguable that that there's no financial upside to it, but vis-a-vis some other more lucrative endeavors that they've been involved in, this has been something that has been a resource drain. I think that's just really a pragmatic reason for it, but there are some more like larger and philosophical or ideological reasons that content moderation has really been the unhappiest part of social media and its rise over the past 15 years from the firm's perspective. The reason is, in many ways, from that ideological standpoint, that the firms themselves, Facebook and others, but of course, Facebook is front and center of everyone's mind. But some that don't even persist today, some that do, is that the way these platforms sold themselves, particularly to the American public, but importantly also to a global user base, was under the auspices of claims of unfettered self-expression, which is a very, very powerful thing. Certainly a principle that is held dearly in the United States, although often misapplied and misunderstood in the context of social media firms, which are of course private companies. But this notion of free expression that would be unfettered, that would essentially be user to platform to world, was incredibly potent and powerful as a message. And so the public was basically sold on this idea of come to our platform and express yourself as you see fit, really without interference, a friction-free, in other words, a friction-free self-expression engine. And very quickly in the development of these platforms, the firms realized that there was really no practical way to offer an experience to users that would be without any sort of guardrails at all. If for no other reason than the firm's primary customer base, being advertisers, simply would see that as too great a liability to brand management of their own brand, and being perhaps misaligned with content that was abhorrent, upsetting, in some cases illegal. And so just as no television station or newspaper or other kind of media company would basically turn on a camera and let anybody walk in from the street, unless we're talking about maybe community access TV from the 80s, neither would these firms. And so they had to quickly develop a mechanism by which to put a pretty big asterisk behind that notion of free and unfettered speech. And content moderation was the catch-all solution to that problem that they had. Now, this is an event from an institute at a law school, and we can certainly go into concepts of things like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and talk about what actual liabilities the firms have and don't have. But beyond the legal issues, there are other concerns, concerns of just public relations, concerns of tolerance that advertisers, their primary customers, have, and so on. And so this idea of content moderation a reactive process of going and trying to clean up mess was born, and it grew exponentially as the platforms themselves grew. But what was so bizarre about this particular practice was that while the firms took up the limelight, and you would be hard pressed a decade ago to find a newspaper that didn't have an article about these new platforms splash across the first section of the paper. You knew nothing about this apparatus and this phenomenon called content moderation, including who was doing it, under what conditions, what rules were they following, and who was benefiting from the practice. None of these things at the time was known. And that secrecy and opacity was by design, because it allowed the firms to have complete control and discretion over the rules of engagement at any given time, and to make those rules be both in the service of their best interests with regard to maintaining their own relationships, and to also change and alter what those best interests might be on the fly, with very little to no accountability to the public. And the number one way to ensure that there would be low to no accountability, which arguably legally they didn't have anyway, but on other grounds they likely had, was to keep that practice secret. And yet, if we were to look at the numbers of people involved in content moderation of social media of a platform like Facebook, we would take a company with ballpark 25,000, 30,000 employees on their rolls, and that number of employees would double were we to count the content moderators who do the work of the company. So it's hardly a small concern. In many ways, it has become, much to the annoyance and general irritation of the firms themselves, it has become, in many ways, the business that they're actually in, which is the adjudication and decision-making around content, a thing they never wanted to be involved in the first place. But in fact, when you endeavor to create a vast social experiment by connecting the entire world, it turns out there's some hard decision-making that goes on. And they have elected in this process to create essentially an auxiliary shadow industry called commercial content moderation. They've done so by putting that work at remove geographically, but also in terms of the relative status and pay that these workers receive, which is typically quite low, certainly vis-a-vis the workers who are direct employees. And they distance themselves in terms of responsibility from the decision-making that goes on, as well as the deleterious effects of content moderation work, which, as many of you now know, is an incredibly taxing, difficult, and often psychologically damaging job. And so I guess for me, the story of the dominance of social media in everyday life cannot be told in a just and truthful manner if we don't also articulate the kinds of other work forms and demands, for example, environmental demands, and other kinds of taxes upon our collective humanity that these firms necessitate. But they will be loath to talk about them as a first order of business. So I'm grateful to have the ability to set the stage with that as we go forward and discuss some of these other issues.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. I think that's an excellent intro to this. And that also, the disconnect between those different business models and the reactive nature of moderation structures or moderation policy, I think is a good entry to our second panelist, Wafa, who I think can maybe provide a little bit of a framing or context of how sort of the past decade we've seen this real shift from a lot of optimism around social media as driving democracy or driving democratization to the present role that some see in social media as a force for undermining democracy.
Thank you so much, Michael, and hello, everybody, and thank you to the panelists as well. Thank you, Sarah, for setting us up so nicely. There's so much to say and so much to go through, but I think it would be really useful for us to just kind of start off by talking about where usage of social media or different types of digital technologies kind of started. And I'm sure many of the individuals watching this panel today realize and understand that back in 2010, 2011, 10 years ago now, social media offered a lot of individuals, a lot of social mobilizers, a lot of activists, a lot of scholars, the opportunity to really connect with one another. It was a channel of organizing, of planning, of starting different initiatives from all sorts of different things, from social mobilization against dictatorial regimes and authoritarianism, to Creative Commons types of work, creative expression generally. It was very, very different than what it is today. And that shift, well, it was also much more global, I would say. The idea that an activist would be able to reach out from a country that may or may not be relevant according to current news and the news cycle generally, to another scholar at UCLA, for example, to talk about what's happening in a country like Tunisia, which nobody heard of before 2010, changed so many things. It was a huge catalyst. But I won't spend too much time there. I would love to talk more about how as we saw social media generally being taken up by different types of actors more and more, increasingly by digitally native actors who understand how this technology works from the day they were born, really showed us that these types of technologies need governance, and they need governance on the international scale, because different types of countries and different types of legal systems and the way that these technological companies interact with them. And for the purposes of this panel, I'll focus on social media companies. The way these social media companies have interacted with these governments differ widely from country to country. And I think that is one of the biggest problems. It's changed things from international relations and affairs to, to having some companies actually start to cultivate different types of relationships with different governments. We've seen different companies try to get closer and have closer relations with human rights violating regimes. We see this more and more today based on the revelations that we've come across, all of us. But to me, one of the most surprising things was that Facebook had a tier system. There was tier 0 for Brazil, India, and the United States, and there was tier 1 for Italy, Germany, France, and I think Israel. Then there was tier 3 that included 22 other countries. And then for everybody else, there was tier 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and the rest of the world was falling into tier 3. How and using which criteria these tiers were decided, whether having a tier system is even correct and applicable and actually acceptable in this world today by such a major company, has not been questioned, because a lot of these documents have remained internal for such a long time. But for a lot of scholars and a lot of activists in the majority world, I would say, understanding that there was this wide variation in content moderation, or even in terms of the resources that are allocated and afforded to different countries, has been known for years. I mean, we've seen this happen. There are plenty of examples in the Middle East. I mean, we see the types of relationships that companies have with regimes there. Contrast that to the relationship they have in the United States, for example, where it is a tier 0. Now we know where there's a constant type of operational care to that country being afforded to it. So we have known about this for a long, long time. And what I think, in terms of, I would like to close with two things. I think it's really important to remember that we need to understand that while we're talking a lot about Facebook these days, it is still the company that spends the most amount on content moderation and these types of resources, but it's still about 4% of its total profit revenue, according to the filings that they file with the SEC. And all of these other companies are dealing with similar issues. And while Facebook is considered the internet by many users around the world, which is problematic to begin with, I think it's equally important to not forget that other social media networks are dealing with the same types of problems. And then finally, my final point in terms of this introduction is that, look, different regimes have different standards that they decide to use with their people, right? And I think again, and it's crazy because people like me sound like a broken record by this stage, but international norms are absolutely needed. We need to have international norms. This is not the first time our world has interacted with global corporations before, and some of the harms that come with that, or some of the challenging governance issues that arise. This is why we have international human rights mechanisms. This is why we have different countries actually sign on and ratify different conventions. We need to be able to think of something that is global in nature and that affords users the human rights that they need and that they are entitled to. Anything other than that will not work. We've seen that self-governance doesn't work. We've seen self-policing doesn't work. In every country in the world, there's a problem. We need to be able to have states take a larger role and civil society be active in those conversations at a global international norm level.
Thank you so much, especially for ending on that point about international dimensions and potentially international collaboration. I think that leads us very well to Nat, who can maybe introduce his own work on the impact of social media on crimes against humanity and how that leads into and informs his own thoughts on this issue.
Well, I just want to say up front that I think the entire concept and context of this week is exactly what we should be talking about. So kudos to Michael and UCLA for having this conversation. If we did this conversation 10 years ago, it would be about what problems we could fix with the internet and with social media. And now we're talking about how we fix the problem of the internet and social media. So my one sentence introduction is I never really cared about technology. I am a war crimes investigator and a humanitarian aid worker by training and profession. I came into these issues as a reaction out of necessity. If I could, I would have nothing to do with these issues, but unfortunately, the digital age is changing how bad actors who commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other gross human rights abuses, how they commit them and how we investigate them and hold them accountable. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but I just want to, I don't know if invert is the word, but edit sort of the frame just a little bit. I think there's two questions here. Question one, we already have on the table, which is how do we develop accountability mechanisms for companies and for actors that are engaged in the harms that we are seeing from social media. I would add a second one, which is how has social media been corrosive to pre-existing accountability mechanisms before the digital era? Because what I want to talk about today is we have the accountability prospective problem, but I'm also seeing, and I want to describe to you how, from my perspective as a human rights investigator, I have seen the norms we had begin to be degraded by something we thought was going to be a reinforcer of norms. And what I mean by that is, let's take the example of Myanmar. In 2017, and this is according to the United Nations Independent Fact-Finding Group, we had Facebook Messenger proved to be integral in the alleged committal of what's called incitement to the crime of genocide. And genocide is a crime internationally, but there is a separate crime by itself, which is incitement to the crime of genocide. What we are discovering is clear evidence that the government of Myanmar, in particular the military, the Tatmadaw, and civil society, non-state actor groups in Myanmar, in particular the Mbatha, used Facebook Messenger to incite the ejection of displacement of 750,000 estimated Rohingya ethnic Muslims from Myanmar into neighboring Bangladesh, and also resulted in the alleged approximately killing of 250,000 individuals. And so the crime of using Facebook Messenger by those actors is pretty clear. It's pretty cut and dry from an international legal perspective. What we find is that when you begin to think about, okay, how does Facebook's accountability for what happened in Myanmar fit into extant international law? The short answer is it doesn't. It actually sits right in the blind spot. If we're thinking about backing out a 16-wheeler into oncoming traffic here, Facebook is legally sitting in the blind spot of international law about incitement because it never considered social media. And the two big precedents we have for thinking about the case of Myanmar is one, Julius Streicher, in the case of Der Stürmer, basically the newspaper of the SS during the Holocaust, and he was convicted and executed for the use of the newspaper to incite genocide against Jews and others. And what we, out of that verdict comes four big elements that really frame up how we think about incitement. One is intent, two is direction, three is control, and four is effect. Okay, well, let's apply those as they were also applied in the case of Rwanda and the media trial. Let's apply that to Facebook. It doesn't work so much. Did Facebook have intent to aid and abet the genocide, alleged genocide of the Rohingya people? Not that we know. Did they direct the messaging? Doesn't seem like it. They ceded that power to the Tatmadaw and other actors, allegedly. And did they control? Yes, they did control the platform, but as we know through reporting by Reuters and others, that they had serious issues with reading the Burmese script. And so it meant that there was what appears to be potential negligence in terms of Facebook about the quality of their ability to read that script. And did it have effect? Oh, yes, it definitely had effect. The United Nations and other organizations can attest to that in their own reporting. So the problem here is not only how do we think about prospective accountability, but accountability unrelated to Facebook and to platforms like it directly. Accountability structures that predate social media's rise technologically don't function well. And so really we have a huge challenge here, which is how do we think about translation of extant norms to make sure that they function and are fit for purpose, even before we think about what new norms we need. And I'll add, and I want to be mindful of time here, there's another area that we have to talk about in this conversation, which is the Geneva Convention. And how do we begin, and I'm working with my students and with the International Committee of the Red Cross now on a project on misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and how do we begin to think about applying the Geneva Convention, other international humanitarian law norms to MDH, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, when these types of LOAC, laws of armed conflict, thought about kinetic harms, AKA things that go boom. What about things that go tweet? And really, this gets to one of the big issues here, and last point I want to close out on is social media's rise is occurring, and this is the most important thing I think I want to say today. Social media's rise began at a time that the world, unrelated to social media, was in a decline and fall of normative framework trajectory. We had the US invasion of Iraq. We had the use of torture by the United States as part of the global war on terror. We had a period of aspirational hope for norms in the 1990s following the end of the Cold War and Bosnia and Rwanda, this idea with the International Criminal Court that we were moving towards a more normatively regulated world. And with the global war on terror, amongst other factors, we are seeing an increasingly post-normative world. That is not caused by social media, but social media in this post-normative term globally occurred at the same time. And now increasingly, the post-normative world and social media's blind spot position in terms of extant norms have catalyzed together into one giant mess. Our ability to create norms and our ability to apply them here, both are are significantly not fit for purpose for this historical moment. The last point I'll say is that Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. I say this all the time. And at this point, the demand in terms of normative creation is unclear.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to go to Dr. Brock next to introduce his own observations on the root cause of the current accountability challenges as you see.
So I come to this panel and I'd like to, it's nice meeting my fellow panelists. I've known Sarah forever, but it's nice meeting the rest of you. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be a part of this. I come to this panel kind of from an outsider perspective. So my preliminary remit is I write about Blackness in the digital. And in the last 5 years or so of my career since the beginning of the millennium, I've turned to something that helps me understand a little bit more about why things happen the way they happen. And what I'm thinking about here, as I talk more in my work about libidinal economy, right? Specifically focusing on anti-Blackness, which is the argument that the Black does not have any access to anything that makes people human, as a design, as an intent, as a method and a process of modernity, but also of whiteness, right? From that perspective, I am able to do two different things in my work. One is to argue that Black folk are not completely bound to that perspective. That is, while the modern Western society culture sees them as perhaps deviant or terrible and unfit participants in civilization, Black people have gone their own path and continue to bring an excess of life to everything they do, right? The other path, though, is a little bit darker, and it's to apply this same libidinal economic analysis to the technologies that I found of interest since the early 2000s. So when people start talking about social media and the harms that it's done to the United States and to the world, I'm often, because I am a rhetorician, drawn to use libidinal economy to examine internet. Not just Web 2.0 and social media, but the internet as an enterprise from its introduction, in 1996 with the Mosaic browser, right? So governance without accountability is an interesting phrase to me, right? When this grand experiment first made its way to the public, and I'm not thinking of the ways that university students and faculty used to use their terminals to play Space War, but more so in the ways that people began to encounter the internet through walled gardens like CompuServe and AOL. Nobody knew what to do with it, right? What we were aware of were the libidinal economic beliefs, the beliefs that technologies were supposed to do things to us and for us. They were to make us more productive. They were to make us more efficient. They were to enable us to connect across time and space. Right. And then underlying those particular beliefs were certain beliefs about what modernity does to and for us. So these computer networks, in connecting us all, would somehow homogenize us all, that we would become a global village, like McLuhan said in 1969, without ever considering whose village it would be. Right. So as non-whites began to trickle onto the web, onto the internet, as it was constructed at that time, largely through Usenet, AOL, CompuServe, and various BBSs. And then as we moved to Web 2.0, people who were not of the mainstream constantly found themselves marginalized, not by algorithms, but by moderation practices of the people who ran those things, who refused to believe that Black folk or non-whites would even participate in these spaces. If you are curious as to what I'm referring to, you could look at Digital Divide Research and Rhetoric, which constantly position people of color, rural folk, and people who are not in the mainstream as being somehow deficient in either the material access, the economic access, or even the literacies, right? And so this idea of governance without accountability, the accountability is always rested upon a certain libidinal economic mode of understanding who can be present in an internet space, what they're allowed to talk about, right? And then what types of subjects can be populated across these various spaces. So when I first started using the internet in the late 1990s, and was complaining that, you know, there's not anything out here for Black people to latch onto. There's nothing that satisfies their information needs or behaviors. I was given a manifest destiny argument. Go out and create your own stuff, right? Why should we have to cater our stuff to you? And I find that this libertarian, technophilic attitude really kind of was cemented and accentuated by the development first of blogging platforms with their attempt, their movement to make the web more accessible to people who wanted to create content. At the time, we were talking about UGC, user-generated content, right? And their ability to overcome the barriers of hard coding HTML and putting up websites and getting hosting names. Instead of doing all that, you could just go to Blogger, create an account, and Blogger would do that for you, right? So we at once had a moment where people could bring their individual selves online, absent the individual or concerted moderation that was present in previous spaces like BBS, bulletin board systems, right? Or CompuServe or AOL, absent those community standards that were enforced by those various stakeholders. And you had an explosion of content, right? That suddenly was no longer moderated or even capable of being moderated. Blogger took a long time, as did TypePad, as did other spaces, to get to the point where they could even moderate the spam and the comments that they added 3 years after. And if you look at the history of Pyro Labs and Blogspot, you'll see that adding comments was something that they really had a lot of worry about, because they knew they couldn't necessarily control what people said in the comments, right? And that same inability or unwillingness to police the various attitudes maps very clearly onto American beliefs of freedom of speech, as poorly as that's understood today, right? But also that certain people are allowed to say certain things and other people are not. So even as we were trying to navigate the first sets of blog comments, newspaper comments and the like, where people began to say, oh, well, if people use their real name, if commenters use their real name, then they won't say bad things. And this is 2006, 2007, we saw the internet companies push back and say, there's no way we can, one, make people behave properly, right, through moderation practices, and there's no way we can keep up with the massive amounts of content. And so I find myself fascinated by accounts of internet incivility that begin with social media, right? Because Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I would argue none of them gained really prominent status until the end of the 2010s. So there's a whole decade before that when these companies were trying to figure out what it was. And the biggest thing they settled on, thanks to YouTube, was don't read the comments. Right? Now imagine that attitude translating to a platform which has suddenly tried to colonize, and I use that term deliberately for Facebook because I've, like you, have been reading the Facebook papers and understanding that Facebook did the American corporation thing where they go into other countries attempting to seize a market without understanding that culture's norms, which explains Myanmar, but also explains the way they've treated the United States themselves as well as other spaces, right? If they're already not willing to do the accountability against people who occupy their same nation state, so they're not willing to enforce those things against enforce content moderation policies against people like gamergaters. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that word. It'll come up in the transcript, right? Or people men who, in the pursuit of the virtualization of desire, right, continue to harass, dox, and otherwise perform violence against women online, or the racist stuff that anybody who's of color who has tried to put up a blog or build out a substantial social following on any of the main websites has had to endure, the amount of abuse that they endure. There's no way that they would then also be accountable for the greater libidinal norms of democracy and justice, right? If you look at how they treat the least of us, you'll understand that eventually what was going to happen was going to trickle up to the rest of us. So I've been in conversations recently about disinformation and misinformation. And I find myself at a polemic moment where I say, well, disinformation isn't new, right? Disinformation is only of interest now because it seems to be undermining the position of white people to continue governance in the way that they once had. It has reintroduced and amplified the paranoid anti-intellectualism that has always been a part of modernity and Western culture. Just, we've had the John Birch Society in the United States. We've had Ron Paul and his weirdness, right, for years. Lyndon LaRouche, if you want to go back that far. We've always had a stream of anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist leaning movements in the United States. But social media and its unwillingness to police the least of us also finds itself in league with those particular movements, because in many ways they espouse libertarian frameworks. The least amount of governance is the best, right? And so I've probably talked too long. I'll try to close with this. One of the things that's most interesting to me is watching people on Twitter, and this is not necessarily a Twitter thing, it even began with LiveJournal, God rest its soul, and later Tumblr, attempt to implement their own methods of accountability and governance, right? One of the more recent ones that has caught my attention is an app called Block Party, right? Where Block Party not only allows you to block people who say something objectionable, but to block the people who liked those objectionable things, right? And it is a perhaps imperfect, because sometimes you'll lose people who may have had a moment. They didn't have a racist bone in their body, but they agreed with something racist because they were having a bad day. You may lose that follower, right? But I find that that particular mode of public health, and that's a specific reference to COVID, that particular mode of vaccination against a widespread epidemic of incivility, brought up from the bottom up, it's not a Twitter initiative, is to me the most promising mode of governance, right? Where the accountability should not necessarily be on an individual level, but on a communitarian collective level that does a lot more to build out a commons that people want to participate in, instead of automatically denominating Twitter, or as earlier, YouTube, as a hell site, as a garbage site. You pick up the garbage. You push the trash to the side so that you can have your breakdance parties or your garden parties, right? And by participating in these particular spaces as informed citizens, there's a lot that can be done that does not necessarily reach the level that I think this panel and this conference is looking at, where I feel as if what we're going to be arguing, what y'all are going to be arguing for is for the rest of the week, is whether or not the ideals of the tech company should be ideals that we support or regulate, whether the ideals of the nation states who seek to regulate those places are something that should be emulated on a nation by nation level or even globally. I ask instead that we also consider the mundane, the everyday people who also have to deal with these things on an individual basis, and look at the steps they take that could be incorporated into larger schemes of accountability. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I saw, as you were speaking, our three other panelists were very emphatically agreeing with you. So I maybe will open it up if Sarah or Wafa or Nat want to respond to that, because there was a lot to dig into there. Sarah, please.
Yeah, I really appreciated that that historicizing and that perspective, Andre, so thank you. And I wanted to return to something that Wafa said expressly, and that I think is a thread throughout what all my colleagues have talked about, which is this clarity that we have, that Facebook and others, but of course we're specifically talking about the market leader, has of really behaving itself as a nation state, right? So we're thinking about this concept of governance and Facebook relating to other nation states, and how it, as you said, how it created these tiers that are worrisome in and of themselves. And what we've really seen over the last few years is a cementing of a development, and then further cementing of these new institutions within Facebook itself. Again, incredibly powerful transnational corporations based in the United States are not a new phenomenon. In fact, we could learn a lot by studying the history of such firms. I'm thinking of IIT in South America, for example, or ITT, excuse me, and or you know, International Fruit Company in Central America, Guatemala in particular. But you know, what we've got now, we've got our policing apparatus essentially through content moderation, or the implementation of the policy of the legislative arm of Facebook. We now have the judiciary in the form of the oversight board, and of course we've always had the executive, and the executive being you know, when Mark Zuckerberg travels abroad, or other members of the C-suite, and are met as heads of state, right? They are treated as heads of state, and so it's not incidental that that's happening. That these arms, these branches of government, of governance and government are being built within Facebook, so that its logic is whole, right? Its logic is complete and unto itself, and it can operate really outside the auspices of everything that we're discussing, because in one way it can demonstrate its ability to perhaps do better on its own self-regulation, certainly than the United States government does around that issue. If you have ever witnessed any of the congressional hearings that purport to put these folks on the ropes, yeah, Andre's laughing because they're comical, they're comically bad. Now, given that tech firms, Facebook and Amazon, are the two biggest lobbyists in DC, it's hard to believe that these Congress people are this ill-prepared. So you have to actually wonder what's really going on. But I just wanted to bring up this notion of a pseudo governance, and I was amused and depressed reading just this morning a piece in the New York Times by Ben Smith talking about the rollout of the metaverse and how Mark Zuckerberg gave interviews to The Verge and then to some newsletter writers. So the pseudo journalism industry is now being engaged to do the work and do the water carrying of the faux nation state of Facebook. So I just wanted to bring that up as a point of consideration as I was thinking about these threads that we just heard from my three colleagues. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to turn it over to Wafa now. I'm sure there's a bunch of areas that you're interested in commenting on. Maybe a part of that as well. When Dr. Brock brought up this idea of the sort of original sin of these networks, these platforms, being that a lot of ways the speech that gets privileged, the speech that gets elevated, is a reflection of the early adopters and users of these technologies. Certainly I imagine that there's an enormous global dimension to that as well. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that or more broadly, but I'll leave that to you.
Right, thank you so much, and completely agreed with all three of my colleagues. US companies are US based. They comply with US regulations, and indeed, they don't see any type of incentive structure at the moment to actually comply or even respect human rights in other countries. I want to go back to what Nathaniel mentioned about digital harms, not having this kinetic element to them, but actually oftentimes digital harms do include physical violence. We've seen this in the United States when it comes to the non-consensual sharing of images, more narrowly defined and deeper harms such as child sexual abuse. And we also see it with more broad harms globally, but also if you look at India, there have been lynchings that have been based on rumors traveling through WhatsApp. These are very physical harms that result in fatal results. So, and the other part of that is that we see that, once again, I agree with what Nathaniel said as well, is that the current public policy infrastructure that we have in place are not fit for purpose at the moment. And when we look at the actual private products, their infrastructure preferences the sustained circulation of various harmful materials at a speed and scale that is entirely unprecedented in our world today. And to echo what Andre said about disinformation, disinformation is certainly not new, and digital disinformation is not new either. In foreign countries, we've seen digital disinformation happen for 10 years now, that impact everything from elections to people's daily lives. And yet I use that term very lightly, but as a Western society have not concerned ourselves with these issues until the canary came home to roost in the United States of America. And all of a sudden, disinformation became very important. Now everybody cares, and we have to invest all of our resources into that. Whereas the majority of Facebook's user base is outside the United States. So, and that is where a majority of their profit emanates from. And I think overlying all of our different comments, because I find it fascinating how each of us brings a different perspective to this conversation. But through the common theme throughout all 4 of our presentations is that there's a problem in that today's decision makers are unelected. They're unaccountable to different sets of interests. Those who hold power are not entrusted to actually do so by society at large. And worse, these policies that they enact actually adjudicate what is and what is not allowed online. This is in more democratic contexts, but in more authoritarian contexts, they actually work to serve the powerful, taking down content that is anti-state, that is anti the ruling regime at the moment. And so by responding to government requests of takedowns in the name of, for instance, anti-terrorism or cybercrime, when in reality they're stifling what would otherwise be legitimately protected free speech. So, and I find that when we stifle people's human rights, the bottom line here is that we have unelected members of society who now, as Sarah said, act as nation states, deciding what is and what is not appropriate for society on everything, ranging from trust and safety to political speech. And all of this is absent any type of meaningful civil society engagement, or the inclusion of voices that are oftentimes the most impacted by these policies. Those that are most vulnerable, they're not actually at the table to make any decision making. So I think that is what we're seeing time and time again. It's what we have to actually be more aware of, that, as a society, we develop some mechanisms that are fallible, that are not necessarily perfect, of having the governed and those that are governing. And in the digital space, which we somehow artificially separate from the real world, we don't have that. And I find that to be extremely problematic.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there as well, especially when you mentioned the perceived disconnect between this sort of hands-off approach of oh, well, we don't want to moderate things, people are going to say what they say, and yet if you go to countries where there are repressive speech rules that are aggressively policed on these platforms, it's a weird dichotomy and a strange dynamic to see. Nat, did you want to follow up?
So let's lay out 3 things about US regulation and US data protection, just to be clear here. One, the United States, unlike Europe, the United States has basically stopped developing modern data protection around the 1970s. And so we have to be very clear that for the past 50 years, when you see data protection such as COPA in terms of child online protections, et cetera, it's demographically specific and it's usually reactive to a known harm. And so since the 1970s, with the Privacy Act in 1974, with FICRA and FERPA, et cetera, we basically did this huge flurry of leading privacy and data protections. And then we stop. And what happens after that, when we see Section 230 in the Communications Decency Act, the past particularly 25 years has been about protecting the market rather than protecting vulnerable populations. And when we protect vulnerable populations, it's usually retrospective. And so that's point one. And we need to be very clear about that. And US regulation, as panelists were saying, becomes de facto global regulation because this is where the companies are coming from. The second point here is that 250,000 dead people in Myanmar, which was not discussed in the congressional hearings, let's be very clear. And I'm sorry for the impact on the mental health of young girls in America. And that is a big issue. But we have not talked about the fact we have 250,000 dead people with Facebook as an integral causal factor. Why? Well, they matter less. And let's be clear about that. The harms that are happening overseas don't matter as much because the revenue in terms of active daily user is not up there compared to the United States and Europe. And so where the most egregious harms are occurring, there frankly is not a financial requirement to do better. And this is the third thing, back to Section 230. We have gone for the first quarter century of the internet and social media age without a basically the critical type of civil tort litigation that other industries have had to determine duty of care. And so my one sentence summation here is that we have not had the type of civil suit because of the indemnification provided by 230 that really helps us understand, as we have in other cases like environmental pollution, what the duty of care is. And so that means we have no risk analysis standard. We have no negligence standard on the technical aspects of curation, akin to the way we have, say, Clean Water, Clean Air Act. And so we need to be very clear to sum up. One, we basically have protected the market rather than people. Two, a lot of the harms we're talking about internationally are happening at the economic bottom of the barrel from a revenue perspective for these companies. And the third and final thing is that we really haven't had the litigation necessary because of the indemnification of this market to really understand some of the things that litigation has figured out in other markets, such as negligence standards. Over.
Yeah, that last point in particular, in addition to the lack of legal norms in this space, but the fact that so many of the worst harms are taking place in areas which are economically, which are not areas where the companies are economically incentivized to focus their resources, is I think a really important one, where there's a lot of ink being spilled on platforms, disproportionate focus on the US as a moderation market, enormously disproportionate focus on the US as a moderation market. But logically, as a business, that makes sense for them to do. That's where their incentives are. That's where their money is made. That's a rational decision, absent other factors that are going to be driving them to forcing them to dedicate resources to places like Myanmar. I want to maybe pass it back. I see Wafa has her hand up, but maybe I want to pass it back to Dr. to Andre first, if he's interested in responding.
If it's just a quick comment, Wafa, go ahead. If it's just a quick comment, go ahead.
Thank you. It is a very quick comment. I actually don't think it's true that I think the fact that we don't know if Facebook or other social media companies make the majority of their profits in the US and Europe, I think just the fact that we don't know that is also problematic. I would push back against the fact that we know for sure that most of the profit comes from the US and the EU, therefore they're acting out of rational interest. Because even when it comes to WhatsApp, we still don't know what the market sizes look like depending on countries. And that's like very basic information that we actually don't have as a society. So just wanted to highlight that.
Response fair and saying from based on what we know, which is ... not what we should know. Yeah, Roger.
That's a fair point and well taken. Andre.
So I'm kind of struck by the use of rational here, because the rationality is tied to modernity's extraction of information for profit, right? So we could really talk more about what it means to be rational for a company to react in the ways that it has to the ongoing regulation around privacy modes, right? The one thing I will say, and this is kind of a follow-up on what Nada said, is that we would be remiss to forget the role of 9/11 and the subsequent Department of Homeland Security in the ways that the United States in particular understands data collection of citizens. So the Patriot Act allowed them to do surveillance on a certain number of citizens, right? And subsequent Republican administrations, and to be fair, the Obama administration too, have allowed and expanded that surveillance to encompass pretty much everybody. And even before we point the finger at social media companies, the first people we should be pointing our fingers at are telecom companies, right? AT&T basically handed data on anybody and everybody to the Justice Department and Homeland Security from 2001 onwards. And this is stuff we talk about in our courses in library and information science, because that part of the Patriot Act is just as important to understanding what the current social media data privacy concerns are as many of the other things that we've mentioned. But Wafa, I love your focus on the international elements of that. And Sarah, we'll always be pretty much in the same headspace, talking about content moderation, but also it's the ways that particular mode of dealing with the agony of people is pushed on to people who are supposedly more spiritually able, right? Or less human. right? The fact that they have to deal with these particular types of content as a way of doing moderation, and then not given any sort of relief or remuneration or even palliative to handle the traumas of dealing with this dark and disturbing content, is an American way to put that labor onto bodies that are not American bodies, right? And that's something I think that's of interest. The one thing I would like to ask my co-panelists, and I know you want to open up to questions, right? But would the European model of data privacy be a better way to address this, right? Are there other state-led models of dealing with data sovereignty? And that's probably a problematic way to put it, but are there other models that could be used to try to push the tech giants into that area? Or should we rely on the goodwill of companies like Apple, which has now made companies lose money because of its desire to say you cannot track, right? Or its implementation of do not track at multiple levels of the operating system. So I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to hear from all the panelists on their thoughts of the different international models that are out there. I'll start with a couple of quick thoughts on that myself, if I can. One is that, so on the privacy side, well, first of all, you can frame this issue in a lot of different ways. When we talk about regulating, there are different buckets of regulation that you can talk about. When you talk about the privacy side, my own thoughts are it's fairly clear that America's lack of privacy protections, of broad privacy protections, is a significant weakness. It's part of how we got to where we are today, and that's absolutely an area that's ripe for regulation. I think that the GDPR has had a significant positive impact. I think that the fact that the GDPR has real teeth is very important. And certainly I'm a supporter of regulation on the privacy side. Likewise, I think that arguments around antitrust enforcement, anti-competition enforcement are very important to explore. I think that there are challenges insofar as there are tensions between aggressive antitrust enforcement, like forcing adversarial interoperability, and how to balance that against the data protection rules that you need, because forcing large platforms to open themselves up to their competitors is difficult to do in a way that provides concomitant protections to people's data. I think there is a tension there that needs to be navigated, but certainly I think that that's also an easy area to move forward on, or conceptually, I don't have as much problems with that. I think on the expression question is where it gets really difficult. And here, the real challenge, which I think Wafa alluded to earlier, is there's a lot of governments in the world that have extremely regressive attitudes towards online speech. And there's, I think, a real distinct tension between saying these companies are unaccountable. Governments, for the most part, have some degree of accountability towards their people. Therefore, we want governments to take a stronger role in what is said or is not said in the online space. That becomes challenging when you consider the number of regressive or abusive speech regulations that are emanating out from a lot of parts of the world, including democratic parts of the world. So, under the American context, you have a government which is very severely curtailed in what they can and cannot do to regulate the online space by the First Amendment. Those rules don't apply, or the same constitutional standards don't apply anywhere else. And there's a lot of speech regulation that is emanating out in other parts of the world, including democratic parts of the world, which is deeply problematic. So that, I think, is the area where I personally am most conflicted when you talk about different international models of speech regulation. And that doesn't mean that, I think that the American constitutional structure is the be all and end all and the way that everybody should do it. But that is where I see the clearest tension and the clearest challenge between how to approach expressive questions from a regulatory perspective. Now, I meant that to be a quick intervention, and it seems to have stretched out quite a bit. So why don't I hand that over to the other panelists, and then we can look at some questions in the chat.
Wafa, are you up next?
Sarah.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment on some of the paradoxes that are at play with with this kind of work, which is that there is this kind of above above ground civil society and other advocacy efforts to push and to force changes in position through procedures that take a long time and take years of effort. At the same time, there's there's a counter movement I've come to discover, whereby the firms, it's almost like they allow those things to take place as a bit of political theater, because what they're actually doing is they are off working through their lobbying arms to do things like enshrine the very American, very Silicon Valley Section 230 principle into the worst anti-democratic kinds of apparatuses there are, which are international trade agreements, thus foisting these contested American legal standards onto other parts of the world where citizens and others really have no recourse. And so the example I'll give of this was during a hearing in, I believe it was October of 2019, when a person representing Google made a casual comment about that to the congressional subcommittee to whom she was speaking. And sure enough, this is the practice that's going on all the time. So it's not even as simple as getting the right strategy together above board. It's that there are these other mechanisms at play that are already themselves highly anti-democratic and outside the ability of people to intervene. In fact, if they're outside the ability for us to even see inside. And if she hadn't kind of let that one drop and I hadn't been listening, I would be probably in the dark about that. So the forces are many, and the strategies are they're ingenious in many regards, and it's very difficult to figure out how to fight against these things, right? I just want to bring that one up.
Yeah, I plus a million what you just said, Sarah. That this is the crucial thing for this week. That Einstein said famously, he was asked, what's the most powerful force in the universe? He said, that's easy. It's compound interest. I would say that that right now, what's the most powerful force in international law? It's the EULA. It's the end user license agreement. And I think in many, for the past 10 years, civil society, we have made a fatal mistake by arguing for international human rights law and IHL as the venue for this conversation. While meanwhile, it was happening. And it was happening in terms and conditions. And the next generation of human rights law or absence thereof is occurring in terms of EULA. And I think now, for me, in work I've been doing with the UN High Commission for Refugees and so forth, I've laser focused on EULAs, and the role of EULAs is a powerful place for new governance, probably significantly more than extant normative frameworks such as human rights law, et cetera. And as a human rights investigator and advocate, it kills me to say that. And so back to the question, which I think is a huge one, European or American model, well, the fact of the matter, I think both, to make things worse, both are deeply insufficient. I don't think we yet have the model we need, because 20th century privacy protection, with many of its antecedents actually in human subjects research protections with Nuremberg and Tuskegee, are based on PII, personal identifiable information. And I wrote in Nature for the anniversary of Belmont Report in response to Tuskegee about the fact that the problem is we're PII centric, and we're dealing with DII problems, demographically identifiable information. Until we have governance norms that think about groups and communities that are in many cases not only real communities, but communities that are imagined in the mind of a computer, our current types of protections without a demographic identifiable information definition, let alone strategy, will fundamentally fail, because the fuel in these machines is group data. And how do you translate PII norms into DII is the central human rights issue of our time. And if we don't figure that out, human rights as we know it go the way of the dodo, because we are applying a PII, an individual Brandeisian privacy norm, to a world where that is not the center of gravity anymore, if ever it was.
I think I can let it rest.
Oh, yeah.
There.
Yeah. So there's been a bunch of questions in the chat, which again, I would invite folks to submit that for. Wafa, did you want to add anything to that? Or didn't mean
Yeah,
to?
I'm good for now. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the first questions that we got, I think ties into these regulatory challenges, from Natasha Fain, and you have to scroll up a little bit. We got it about 12:30, I think. But she asks whether we should frame the needed regulatory work over social media companies within a broader need for anti-corruption efforts within the United States in order to prioritize citizens over corporate interests in implementing international human rights norms. I think that goes beyond implementing human rights norms. I think that's a broader call. You know, and I also think that I don't want to get us too far into the weeds of Citizens United, and mostly because that takes us slightly off topic. But maybe it would be good to consider as a regulatory challenge, you know, the tensions that we see between governments trying to craft regulation, which the tension that we see governments in the regulations getting crafted, and how corporate interests do have an enormous voice seat at the table, how there have been some concerns raised that new regulations that get passed are going to end up entrenching the position of major platforms as opposed to providing real protections to the public. I don't know, do folks want to jump in on that concern and that dynamic, and how we move to a place where regulation is done in a way that actually addresses these problems?
I could take a stab at this question because you know, as you were speaking, Michael, I was thinking about, you know, multinational corporations in the past that have had significant environmental impacts globally, but not necessarily in the United States, that are, you know, essentially US companies that have had their genesis. They've been, you know, they grew up, so to speak, they germinated in the United States and then took their operations global. And we see that oftentimes they do not hold the same standards in the United States or in countries in the global north as they do in the global south or the majority world. In the past, I think just thinking about different cases I've actually studied before is, I think the way some activists have gone about assessing and addressing that issue really is bringing those cases to a jurisdiction or a court system that will accept the complaints, right? The complainant's claims. Essentially, let's say the water is being contaminated, and the government in that jurisdiction will not accept hearing a court case about it because perhaps the officials receive kickbacks from the corporation, or perhaps there's close relationships that are being built. Perhaps that corporation has cultivated those relationships, as we see with tech companies today. So, and I'm positive that having some sort of a non-legislative, non-regulatory approach is also beneficial in this sense, where if we want to use the US standards, so-called US standards for free speech, which again, as several of my colleagues on this panel have identified, are not the end-all be-all for the way different countries think about speech, but perhaps that type of legal activism could and should have a route towards actually holding companies accountable for the actions that they do globally. Just throwing that out there, but you know, I was thinking about that a lot as I was hearing the question.
Any of our other anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Just a bit. At first, when I heard the word anti-corruption, I thought that's a novel way to approach it. But the more I think about it, that might make sense. So what I'm thinking of is the idea, and this is based on what Nadia said, that demographically identifiable information is the black gold what a terrible term, is the black gold of the information economy. And it's being pushed as much by venture capitalists and Wall Street as it is by technologists, right? And so I was really pleased to see the elevation of Lena Khan to the FTC, right? Because I think the FTC is really the only way that we can at least start to slow down that flood of information into the hard drives of marketers, third parties, and governmental entities, at least begin to slow it down so that that type of use of information can't be addressed. But what they're doing isn't illegal, which is part of the problem, right? It's, again, I was thinking that when you were talking of the problematics of strict scrutiny as a framework for equal employment opportunity law, or having to demonstrate racism in a court of law, right? You have to find racism in somebody's heart. Similarly, you'll have to find, corruption in somebody's heart to say that what they're selling this data for is something that is an egregious harm to the parties that are claiming that they have a problem with it, right? So they'll say, well, we aggregated the data, so there's no way this individual could claim harm. Never mind the fact that the information then, once it's been sold, is then reverse engineered to target individuals. That part doesn't get covered under the law. And so I think taking it on from a corporate mode, right? Not necessarily anti-corruption, but trying to re-enshrine, back to this word, a bit of sovereignty, right? To not just for personal information, but also, again, for communities, right? To not allow corporations to sell that information, I think, is a crucial first step towards getting some of these harms slowed down, if not halted. I could be off base, though. I'm just spitballing.
I feel like you're describing, Andre, sort of an American version of the German constitutional court concept of informational self-determination. And so I think, and I'm sure a lot of our audience today have examples I've never heard of, but I'm looking for examples of where we see group acts of informational self-determination, whether through the law or through other means. An example, a colleague of mine at the University of Saskatchewan, who is Maori, talked to me once about the role of the tribal governance in New Zealand, preventing overflights of drones, extracting pictures of Maori land, or things occurring on Maori sovereign soil. And I found this fascinating because they're saying, okay, we can't be imaged in certain settings without our consent as a group, and trying to think about what do accountability structures that allow for group informed participation in the absence of individual consent applying effectively to prevent these harms. What are our antecedents to try to build those types of group-based structures, sometimes when the group doesn't know that it's being affected in a causal way? And I think of Obermeyer's, and all my students are now rolling their eyes if they're on this talk, Obermeyer's study in science on the role of the Impact Pro algorithm from United Healthcare, which is allegedly under investigation by the state of New York and Letitia James, for not seeing race in terms of decisions about prioritization of advanced healthcare. And I think finding these examples are really going to determine, for good or for bad, what the next modes of accountability look like. Over.
Yeah, we had a comment in the chat pointing to that was Andre pointing to differential privacy among Indigenous citizens in Alaska. I think if you look, there's some interesting examples in Canada as well with the First Nations. In countries where Indigenous populations are politically active and are politically consolidated, I should say, and can mobilize some political clout as a result of that. There are some really interesting ideas about data sovereignty, about privacy, and about cultural ownership that are emanating from those corners. And I always find that really interesting because it often poses a really direct and frontal challenge to some of the property or personality rules on which our sort of Western Canadian or American legal structures are built on. So I always find that really interesting, especially as it drives a rethinking of some of these core principles. We have a question from Kalia in the chat who asks, how do we support ethical, organic, good data practices and create ways for businesses to reach potential customers that is not via the current aggregated data markets that are predatory? I want to reframe that slightly, although maybe the panelists can certainly answer that directly if they want. But the question that I want to ask, which is kind of similar to that, is, we've heard a lot about approaches to problem solving or approaches to responsibility that are heavily reactive by the platforms. There's a problem, there's a fire, how do we put that fire out? That, to me, has dominated the approach to these challenges across the tech sector, at least for as long as I've been involved. So I guess in addition to that question of, how do we promote more responsible business practices, I would ask, how do we promote proactive problem solving in this sector as opposed to creating an avenue where companies are trying to mitigate harmful effects? And that's a tough one, I understand, because I think maybe that's the whatever it is, $64,000 question or whatever the number comes to. But we've heard a few ideas. I think Nat raised the idea of better liability as part of that. Wafa, what are your thoughts?
I think the answer is multifold and multifaceted, and there's probably many answers to your question. But one of them is an obvious one to me, is just the business model. I find that it's difficult to ask of companies to take the interests of various stakeholders all at once when their business model still prioritizes making a margin of profit over anything else. And I think so long as that is the ruling, so long as that is king, so to speak, I think it'll be difficult to move the needle on this. And that's why I also echo my colleagues, and also being happy that Lina Khan is now chairwoman of the FTC. So there is some movement there, and surely it'll perhaps start in the US, maybe it's already started in the EU, but I think that's one path.
Yes, certainly. I'm glad you mentioned Lina Khan again, because I meant to mention that certainly across the legal academy, folks were very, very excited at her being elevated. And I think there's certainly across the people the networks that I'm in, or whatever it is, across the legal academy, there was a lot of interest in her and what she's going to do, because that certainly has the potential to have a significant positive impact. Sarah or Nat or Andre, any thoughts on building structural improvements or building a structural sense of responsibility at these platforms or in the tech sector?
I certainly agree with what Wafa said. I mean, one thing that's baffled me throughout my time in the work that I've done is the way that the tech industry has done so much. I mean, first of all, calling it the tech industry at all is an example of its own ability to shapeshift and self-determine to its own benefit, right? Has done such a masterful job of convincing all that it is so sui generis that nothing that has gone before it can be applied. And so, to the question about advertising, I think about all of the ways in which the advertising models are in total contravention of US federal law, for example, on so many levels. Around issues of race, redlining, inappropriate demographic targeting, or rescinding for things like job ads. I mean, the list goes on and on. Things that were fought and decided upon decades ago and adjudicated in an actual court called the Supreme Court, right? And so I'm always amazed at the ways that these there seems to be this slippage. I would also add things like election advertising to that mix, that inexplicably, the social media platform seem to fall outside of federal regulation around that. So, one thing, again, with the with Lena Khan, I think one of the hopes that many of us have is that could we just see enforcement of extant law applied to this sector? And that would be an incredible leap. Like, that's like a no-brainer. Nothing new really needs to happen legislatively or judicially, as far as I know. And I'm obviously not a lawyer, everybody knows that, but I am a person who's fairly informed. And it's always just blown my mind that there's that slippage. Yeah, and Andre's on point there too. I mean, where, this is the result of 40 plus years of the denigration of government, and the hoodwinking of the American public in particular around somehow the government being against them. We've denuded all of these agencies to the point of impotency. We need to reinvigorate them, empower them to enforce the laws that exist in a meaningful way. This sector is not so magical that it can't be understood. On the contrary, right? And I think I'd like to see some efforts towards enforcement of existing extant law.
Yeah, I'll hand it back over to Nat, and then there's a really interesting question that was just put in the chat, I think.
So values are fragile things, and they are only as strong as the institutions. Well, Andre has a different view, and I want to hear it, but they're only as strong as I think the institutions, formalized and informal, that house them, including culture. And I think what happens when norms are where our memory collectively takes action. If we think about the origins of the Department of Justice in terms of, in part, response to the Klan, what I'm trying to express here is that norms are reflective of our memory, and that what has happened, to build off of what Sarah's saying, which I think is essential, is that there has been a dehistoricization, I don't know if that's a word, but a forgetting that has been part of the tech turn. This idea that we are viewing everything through a veil of newness, and that in fact, we in that forgetting, we lose norms, and we lose memory of why the norms happened. And so I think Sarah is absolutely right. Looking at the best moments, let's have a moment of the best moments of tech enforcement. And in recent years, it is, the Fair Housing Act being applied to Facebook, seeing Copa and Peppa the Pig with Google. It is those moments of translation, just as Sarah was saying, that of extant law onto new technological modality is essential. Now, but at the end of the day, these things only happen if there is political will. And we can talk as academics till we're blue in the face. But at the end of the day, these are not technical questions, these are political ones.
The only reason why I did this, Nat, is that I find ethics are the fragile ones, values are enduring, right? So we went from Google saying don't be evil to now doing whatever it is they're doing in various markets or spaces, right? The only thing I would add to this, and this is, I saw the question that you have coming up, Michael, but I find that as a racial realist, a la Derek Bell, I find that I have to continue to acknowledge the fact that these institutions and practices exist while I dedicate my being towards fighting them, right? And so asking what can we do to stop modernity from continued extraction in the name of capitalism, we're not going to fix that right now. What we can do, however, is keep asking questions of the people who do these practices and make them uncomfortable enough to where hopefully they will be moved to make those changes, right? And it sounds like a weak sauce position. Like my warrior friends would be like, well, that's all you're going to do. And I'm like, well, it's a start, right? Especially as an educator, right? Teaching students who were then going to Disney and Intel and Microsoft, moving past an ethical framework to talk about a moral framework, not quite so far as WAFA and the human rights thing, because I probably should pay more attention to that, but asking them to be more critical of the values they're uncritically adopting as they create technologies for venture capitalists. Right, that's the start that I'm trying to do. That's the work that I continue to do. Right, and so that kind of sort of is my answer to the question. It's not a good one, but it'll work for now.
No, that's great. I just want to, we're almost at time, but I would just want to, because we have that last question, see if anybody wants to take a shot at how do we turn the tide of datification when the solution to the problems always seems to be bringing in more data? Yeah, please.
Quick stab. The United States has always been about the technical fix. Right? They always have wanted to do technical fixes to social problems because actually dealing with the root causes is much more expensive than creating, say, a mechanical and industrial and electronic way to fix things. So instead of getting better education, we have colleges of education who have spent the last 100 years trying to devise new ways to teach students, whether it's Common Core or Your Child Left Behind or the like, and none of them actually improve educational outcomes for students. What actually improves educational outcomes for students is if you pay their parents more, so they have more money, so that they aren't hungry, right? Those things cannot be addressed at the root cause. Those things will never be addressed at the root cause because America would rather spend more money on automation than it would on worker protections, right? And so it's a great question. And I think that the key is to push back as some of the cities did with the recent defund movement, to step away from technical fixes such as more policing to solve mental health crises and actually devote the resources that are intended to address those crises to those particular things. So less of a technical, more of a human-aided, humanistic mode of inquiry, I think is the key for us at this point.
Yeah, I saw a lot of nodding on the panel and certainly frustration with the tech solutionism. Unless there's any pressing interventions, because we're just about at time, I think I will thank our fantastic panelists. That was
great.
Yeah, oh yeah, that was a really interesting conversation, and I think a really good start to consider these questions. For folks in the audience that are interested in joining us tomorrow at the same time, when we will welcome Evelyn Aswad from the Facebook Oversight Board, Bernard Shen from Microsoft, and Dunstan Allison Hope from BSR to discuss the challenges that companies face in developing accountability structures and engagement. So I hope folks can also join us for that. Thanks again to all of our panelists. This was a really interesting discussion and I think a really good start to the series.
Thanks,
Thank you
Michael,
for
for including us. Thanks.
Thank you for take care.